Okay, we're going to read chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby. Remember, as you are annotating for chapter 5, you want to annotate for again and again, contrast and contradictions, and memory moment. Okay, so make sure that you highlight and identify those parts of the reading as we read. Also, remember that you have to complete journal entries with 2 of the reading strategies that I just listed there. So you need to do 2 of them. Also, when you are reading, annotating for things that surprise you, put question marks for words you don't know, any confusing text, anything that you have questions about. You can put a star for any kind of character information that would be important as you read. All right, so let's go ahead and start reading chapter 5. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2 o'clock and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongated glints upon the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first I thought it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into hide-and-go-seek, or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown open to the game. But there wasn't a sound, only wind in the trees, which blew the wires and made the lights go off and on again, as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across his lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes toward it absently. "I have been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, Old Sport, in my car." "It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer." "I've got to get to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. "I talked with Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." So remember the end of chapter 4, we had the scene where Nick and Jordan Baker were at tea and she had the flashback remembering when Daisy and Gatsby met each other and were in love with each other. So remember at the end of that conversation, Nick had agreed to invite Daisy over so he could get Gatsby and Daisy in the same room, same house. So Nick just said, "I talked with Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble." So here we can kind of get a glimpse of contrast and contradictions because, we've seen Jay Gatsby be really calm, cool, and collective at his party. And then last chapter we saw he had a bunch of anxiety within him. And now he's kind of playing that calm, cool, collective person again. So his behaviors are kind of contradicting themselves. He doesn't really act one way or the other. His reactions to things are all over the place. "So what would suit you? What day would suit you?" he corrected me quickly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see." "How about the day after tomorrow?" He considered for a moment. Then with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. "There's another little thing," he said uncertainly, and hesitated. "Would you rather put it off for a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't about that. At least," he fumbled, with a series of beginnings. Why, look here, Old Sport. You don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't. If you'll pardon you see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand, and I thought that if you don't make very much, You're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport? Trying to. Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing. So we can see here, um, the last chapter, you were introduced to Meyer Wolfsheim, and we know that Meyer Wolfsheim is into illegal dealings. So this right here is kind of showing us that Gatsby is into an illegal business as well, because he's trying to get Nick to do some rather confidential sort of things to make a nice bit of money. I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life, but because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. I've got my hands full, I said. I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any more work. You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim. Evidently he thought that I was shying away from the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. So we have this mention again of the business connection with Wolfsheim. This was from last chapter. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive, so he went unwillingly home. The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door, so I didn't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island or for how many hours he glanced into rooms while his house blazed gaudily on. I called up Daisy from the office next morning and invited her to come to tea. Don't bring Tom, I warned her. What? Don't bring Tom. Who is Tom? She asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. Okay, so this next section, I want you to make sure that you're paying attention to the rain. And the reason why is because weather can predict or show behavior in characters. We're going to see that the way that some of our characters act during this time is dependent or is the same as like the rain, how heavy it's raining versus it's misting. So just, keep an eye out on that. So at 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat dragging a lawnmower tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among soggy white-washed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later, the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie, hurried in. He was pale, and there were dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. So we see here that Gatsby is dressed very fancy. He wants to show off his money that he has to Daisy. But we also know that he hasn't slept because he has sleeplessness beneath his eyes. Is everything all right? He asked immediately. The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean. What grass? He inquired blankly. Oh, the grass in the yard. He looked out the window at it, but judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. Looks very good, he remarked vaguely. One of the papers said they thought the rain would stop about 4. I think it was the Journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea? I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the Finn. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. Will they do? I asked. Of course. They're fine. And he added hollowly, old sport. The rain cooled about 3:30, so here's another mention of the weather. It's 3:30, so Daisy's coming at 4. So we see here that the rain cooled to a damp mist. So it went from raining to just kind of misting. To a damp mist through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished tread that shook the kitchen floor, and peering toward the bleared windows from time to time, as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally, he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why's that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. So we're seeing that he's becoming very impatient. Um, and this could be, again, because of his nerve. He's nervous. Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and a little harrowed myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. Excuse me. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a three-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down, with my ear alone before any words came through. So here we are again, talking about Daisy's voice. We heard about her voice, how it was flirtatious and how it drawed people into her back in chapter 1. So we're hearing about her voice again in chapter 5. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rackrent. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy. Then in a grave murmur, his name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. So Gatsby, he's left. He's gone. He's not even in the room anymore. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. So we can mark this down as contrast and contradiction, because his behavior right now is definitely a behavior that we haven't seen from him, especially compared to how he acted at his party, how confident he was, how relaxed and laid back he was at his party. But now we see him again with the ball of anxiety. Hands are in his pocket like weights. And he's glaring tragically at Nick. With his hands still in his pocket, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain. So here is that mention of weather. So when Daisy arrived, it was misting, and now that we have Jay Gatsby back in the room in the house, and after we've seen like his anxiety is so high, the rain now has increased, picking up and showing those emotions. For half a minute there wasn't a sound. Then from the living room I heard a sort of choking murmur, and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece, in a strange counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened, but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair. "We met before," muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. So he's trying to stand like very cool, very calm, very collective against the fireplace. And try to imagine this in your head. He's leaning back against it, trying to appear all cool and like calm. And then all of a sudden, he leans back way too far that this clock falls. So it falls. He's like stumbling around it. He turns around and he catches it. So he's just kind of making a fool of himself. Then he sat down rigidly and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. "I'm sorry about the clock," he said. My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn, so Nick is like extremely, extremely, extremely embarrassed. His face is a deep tropical burn, so his face is red. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of the thousands in my head. "It's an old clock," I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. "We haven't met for many years," said Daisy, her voice as matter of fact as it could ever be. 5 years, next November." Okay, so he said 5 years next November. So this would be like, I think, really shocking and alarming if someone just kind of spit that out, that they knew down to the day how many years it's been. So this may be shocking to Nick and to Daisy to hear. The automatic quality, so I'm going to annotate that with an exclamation point. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen with the demonic Finn, when the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow, and while Daisy and I looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back." "I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh, God," in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake. You're just embarrassed, that's all. And luckily," I added, "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed," he repeated incredulously. "Just as much as you are." "Don't talk so loud. You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there, all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looking at me with unforgettable reproach, and opening the door, cautiously went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black-knotted tree, whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaved by Gatsby's gardener, abound in small muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. So again, we have the mention of rain again. Right here, it says, once more it was pouring. So again, with Nick's actions and his behavior, not Nick, but with Gatsby's actions and his behavior and how awkward it is, how tense it is, the rain again is pouring. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it, like Kant at his church steeple for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze a decade before. and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps their refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into an immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry. After half an hour, the sun shone again. So we have the sun coming out. So let's see how everyone's mood in the house is. And the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servant's dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaning from a large central bay, spit meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little, now and the with gusts of emotions. I should say now and then with gusts of emotions. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen, short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some questions had been asked, or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in, she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word or a gesture of exaltation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the room. So we can highlight this. His behavior has changed. He went from being this anxious ball to now he is happy. He is glowing. So his whole demeanor has changed, which contradicts how he was acting in the beginning of this chapter. "Oh, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. It stopped raining. Okay, here it is. We've seen this whole weather thing happen within this scene, and now that Gatsby is happy, we've noticed that the rain has stopped. Has it? When he realized what I was talking about, that there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, he smiled like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that? It's stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat full of aching, grieving beauty told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face, too late, I thought, with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. "Yes." His eyes went over it, every arched door and square tower. "It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically, "but I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war." I think he hardly knew what he was saying, for when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it wasn't the appropriate reply. You could consider also his behavior here. He's never really talked that way to Nick, so that could be a contrast to his overall behavior on how he has always been really reserved with how he talks to Nick, and now he's so wrapped up in Daisy that he's not really paying attention to how he's talking. Maybe it's making him come across as not being refined in portraying that high society person. He goes on to say, "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either one now." He looked at me with more attention. Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night? Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. Before we move on, this would be a good example of again and again. He's bringing up that like business connection thing, asking him when he asked him if he wanted to make a little money on the side. So he's brought it up again. His maybe his illegal businesses. He wants Nick to be a part of it. Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. That huge place there, she cried, pointing. Do you like it? I love it. But I don't see how you live there all alone. I kept it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things, celebrated people. Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect or that of the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the sparkling odors of jonquils, and the frothy odor of hawthorn and plum blossoms, and the pale gold odor of kiss me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out of the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. So this scene is kind of like a contrast and contradictions because there's no one at Gatsby's house, right? He's usually having all these people, all the parties. So right now, the environment of, the house right now, there's nobody there, so it's contrasting how in chapter 3 and 2 there was the huge parties at his house all night long. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed them. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs, through period bedrooms, swathed in rose and lavender silk, and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms, and bathrooms with sunken baths, intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath and an Adam study, where we sat down and drank a glass of some chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. So here, catch this, he's watching every response that Daisy has to things in his house, and if she values them, more than likely he'll keep them. If she doesn't value them, or if she doesn't like them, more than likely to please her, he will get rid of her. So we're going to continue to read, and it's just going to be about all the lavish things that he has to impress her, to show her that he has enough money to take care of her. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence, none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure, dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't, when I try to." He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. So, like, Gatsby is finally coming down from this high of, like, meeting Daisy and, like, having her in his house. So he's just moving through all those feelings. Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets which held his masked suits, dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts, piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids and coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strange sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." After the house, we were to see the grounds and the swimming pool and the hydroplane and the midsummer flowers, but outside Gatsby's window it began to rain again, so we stood in a row looking at the corrugated surface of the Sound. So we have this weather coming back. Let's pay attention as we read to see if emotions or anything like that start to change. "If it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay," said Gatsby. "You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock." Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed to absorb in what he had just said. So we have the mention here, again, of the green light at the end of their dock. Remember that green light we saw at the beginning of chapter 1 of Gatsby reaching out to it. He was essentially reaching out to Daisy. Daisy was the thing that he wanted to reach. But now that he has her, the green light really is not a symbol anymore of him getting her. So Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. I began to walk about the room, examining various indefinite objects in the half-darkness. A large photograph of an elderly man in a yachting costume attracted me, hung on the wall over his desk. "Who's this?" That's Mr. Dan Cody, old sport." The name sounded faintly familiar. "He's dead now. He used to be my best friend years ago." There was a small picture of Gatsby also in a yachting costume on the bureau. Gatsby with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. "I adore it," exclaimed Daisy. "The pompadour. You never told me you had a pompadour. Or a yacht." "Look at this," said Gatsby quickly. "Here's a lot of clippings about you." They stood side by side, examining it. I was going to ask to see the rubies when the phone rang, and Gatsby took up the receiver. "Yes? Well, I can't talk now, old sport. I said a small town. He must know what a small town is. Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town." He rang off. So we have another instance of like these telephone calls again. Remember, he always gets interrupted by having to take phone calls for businesses or for his businesses. He rang off. "Come here quick," cried Daisy at the window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness had parted in the west, and there was a pink and golden billow of foamy clouds above that sea. "Look at that," she whispered, and then after a moment, I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around." So Daisy wants time to stand still almost. She doesn't want this moment that they're having to leave them. "I tried to go then, but they wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps my presence made them feel more satisfactorily alone." "I know what we'll do," said Gatsby. "We'll have Clip Springer play the piano." He went out of the room, calling, "Ewing! and returned in a few minutes, accompanied by an embarrassed, slightly worn young man with shell-rimmed glasses and scanty blonde hair. He was now decently clothed in a sport shirt, open at the neck, sneakers, and duck trousers of a nebulous hue. "Did we interrupt your exercises?" inquired Daisy politely. "I was asleep," cried Klipspringer, in a spasm of embarrassment. "That is, I'd been asleep. Then I got up." "Klipspringer plays the piano," said Gatsby, cutting him off. "Don't you, Ewing, old sport?" "I don't play well. I don't. I hardly play at all. I'm all out of "We'll go downstairs," interrupted Gatsby. He flipped a switch. The gray windows disappeared as the house glowed full of light. In the music room, Gatsby turned on a solitary lamp beside the piano. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match and sat down with her on a couch far across the room, where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. When Klipspringer had played the Love Nest, he turned around on the bench and searched unhappily for Gatsby in the gloom. "I'm all out of practice, you see. I told you I couldn't play. I'm all out of "Don't talk so much, old sport," commanded Gatsby. "Play!" "In the morning, in the evening, ain't we got fun?" Outside the wind was loud, and there was a faint flow of thunder along the sound. So we have some words here. We have here that he's looking for Gatsby in the gloom. Down here, outside the wind was loud. There was a faint flow of thunder along the sound. All the lights were carrying on in West Egg now. The electric trains, men carrying, were plunging home through the rain from New York. It was the hour of a profound human change, and excitement was generating on the air. One thing's sure and nothing's sure. The rich get richer and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time. As I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. So here we see Nick. This is a little surprising. Nick is seeing that Gatsby has a look of doubt on his face. So Gatsby could be realizing that Daisy may not be the same girl he loved or the same person that he thought she was 5 years ago. Almost 5 years ago, there must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. So right here, he said Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. So this is like Gatsby. He's built this moment up so much over the past 5 years that maybe it's not living up to what he had hoped. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. So this is again and again with Daisy's voice. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me remotely, possessed by intense life. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. All right, that's the end of chapter 5. Remember, make sure that you do your 2 journal entries, and they have to be over any of the reading strategies. So again and again, memory moments, or contrast and contradictions. If you have any questions, just send me an email.